Grief, Eleanor had learned, was not a sudden storm that cleared the air. It was a slow, invisible mold that grew in the quietest corners of a life. For 4 years, she had lived in the shadow of that quietness. She had built a smaller world out of the wreckage of her marriage to Arthur Vance, a marriage that, even before the accident, had been defined by a devastating kind of absence. Arthur had been a brilliant financial risk analyst, a man whose mind operated entirely on logic, cold numbers, and predictable outcomes. To accommodate the weight of his career and his growing, impenetrable silence, Eleanor had willingly shrunk herself. She had walked away from her own promising trajectory as a senior auditor at a prestigious firm in Boston, choosing instead a standard, low-stress accountant position at a local family-owned supermarket chain. It was a choice born of love, or perhaps the illusion of it. It allowed her to ensure dinner was on the table by 6 p.m., to press his shirts to a flawless crisp, and to manage their home like a well-oiled machine. In return, Arthur had given her cold violence, not screams, not physical cruelty, but a calculated emotional isolation. He treated her not as a partner, but as a reliable piece of household furniture, existing in the background of a life he refused to share. Then came the storm off the coast of Maine. Under United States maritime law, when a person disappears at sea, the legal system usually demands an agonizing 7-year waiting period before issuing a death certificate. However, Arthur's disappearance had fit the strict criteria of the perils of the sea doctrine. The tracking data from his rented sailboat had cut out abruptly during the peak of a catastrophic Category 2 gale. Days later, the U.S. Coast Guard recovered shattered hull debris, and his blood-soaked life vest tangled in the rocky shoals. The evidence of fatality was legally overwhelming. The court expedited the declaration of death. In the wake of the tragedy, a $240,000 life insurance policy was paid out. But Eleanor, guided by an innate financial integrity and a desire to keep her hands clean of tragedy, refused to touch a single cent. She immediately placed the entire payout into an irrevocable educational trust fund, legally locking it away exclusively for their son, Leo. For 4 years, she raised Leo entirely on her modest supermarket salary, proud of her self-reliance, wearing her grief like armor. The cracking of that armor began on a humid Tuesday afternoon at Logan International Airport. It was meant to be their turning point, the very first vacation Eleanor had forced herself to book since the funeral. Leo was 9 now, a highly observant and sensitive boy who had been only 5 years old when his father vanished into the Atlantic. They were standing in the crowded TSA boarding line for a flight to the Gulf Coast, surrounded by the ordinary hum of travelers, when Leo suddenly froze. His knuckles turned white around the strap of his backpack. "Mom," Leo whispered, his voice dropping to a fragile, raspy register that made Eleanor's heart stall. "Look." Eleanor knelt to his height, her eyes scanning the crowd. "What is it, Bug? Just too many people." "No," Leo muttered, his gaze locked entirely on the boarding Q2 rows ahead of them. "The man in the gray jacket. Look at his neck." Eleanor followed her son's rigid finger. A man stood with his back to them, adjusting a carry-on bag. He was taller, tanner, and his hair was threaded with a distinguished silver that hadn't been there 4 years ago. But as he tilted his head to speak to someone, the airport terminal's harsh fluorescent lights caught his skin. There, stark against his collar, was a large, faded, L-shaped burn scar. Time is violently compressed. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. When Leo was a toddler, his favorite place in the world was perched on his father's shoulders during long Sunday walks through Boston Common. Every single time, the boy's small fingers would instinctively reach out to trace that exact L-shaped scar, a tactile anchor of childhood safety. A child of 5 might forget a face after 4 years of absence, but the body remembers the shapes it clung to, as if sensing the weight of their stare. the man turned sideways. The profile was unmistakable. It was Arthur. He was entirely alive, radiating a vital, unburdened energy Eleanor had never seen in him during their marriage. He laughed, a genuine, easy sound, and leaned down to catch the words of Clara Sterling, a warm, bright young woman with a camera slung over her shoulder. Clara smiled back, her hand resting naturally against his arm, radiating the effortless comfort of a woman who believed she was completely safe in the love of the man beside her. Eleanor stood up slowly, her knees locking. The world around her blurred into a deafening roar, but the tears she expected did not come. Instead, a cold, piercing clarity washed over her. The invisible wife, the grieving widow, the woman who had spent 4 years clearing a plate that was never dirted. She looked at her living husband, and the crying stopped before it could even begin. The human brain, Eleanor knew from a career spent staring at skewed ledgers, always seeks to balance the equation. When faced with an anomaly, it demands a correction. For 4 years, she had been the anomaly, the ghost widow living a life halved by grief. But as she watched Arthur board the plane under the heavy, humid sky, the emotional ledger inside her shifted. The sorrow didn't vanish. It reallocated. The woman who had quietly accepted the cold violence of his silence was gone. In her place stood a forensic auditor who had just found a massive, unforgivable discrepancy in her own life. She did not make a scene. She did not scream his name across the terminal. Instead, she took Leo's freezing hand, walked onto the plane, and sat in her designated seat, 14C. 2 rows behind her sat the man she had buried. For 3 hours, as the aircraft hummed over the American heartland, Eleanor stared at the flight path on the small screen in front of her. She listened to Leo's quiet, terrified breathing beside her. She felt no panic, only a profound, chilling focus. Arthur was not dead. He had used her, their son, and the entire legal system as a smokescreen. When they landed on the Gulf Coast, Eleanor followed him at a distance. The ultimate insult came when they boarded the same resort shuttle. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculation error she had yet to solve. They arrived at the sprawling coastal resort, a paradise of palm trees and artificial luxury. She watched from the shadows as Arthur and the blonde woman checked in. By evening, Eleanor had her first target, his new identity. To break through the ironclad privacy laws of a high-end American resort without a federal warrant required more than anger. It required professional execution. The next afternoon, Eleanor initiated her plan. She walked into the resort's automated business center, selected a large, official FedEx cardboard envelope, and printed a professional label addressed to the resort. On the front, she stamped a bold, red ink note from her personal audit kit. Urgent corporate tax audit, confidential disclosure. She waited until 3:15 p.m., the exact peak of the afternoon check-in rush, when the lobby was a chaotic sea of frustrated tourists and ringing phones. She stepped up to a young, visibly stressed front desk clerk whose eyes were darting between 3 open screens. Eleanor leaned in, her voice dropping into a calm, authoritative, upper management register. "Hi, I'm the executive liaison for Vance and Associates. I have a time-sensitive federal tax disclosure that requires a direct, physical signature from a Mr. Damon Cross in room 302. His private line is currently encrypted, and the IRS compliance window closes in 20 minutes. The clerk's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Ma'am, I can't give out guest information. I don't need his information, dear. I already have his file." Eleanor interrupted smoothly, sliding her own corporate ID badge just close enough to confuse the eye. "But if I drop sensitive, unredacted financial data into the wrong hands, it's a federal privacy violation for both of us. I just need you to look at your screen and verify if his registered billing Address matches the corporate office in Henderson, Nevada. Yes or no? Let's save both the paperwork. Flustered by the jargon and the artificial urgency, the clerk typed the room number. As the screen flashed open, Eleanor's trained eyes bypassed the clerk's face entirely. Her photographic memory locked onto the glowing text, Damon Cross. DL, Nevada, DOB, identified. She caught the full address, the credit card type, and the confirmation. Yes, it says Nevada, the clerk muttered, relieved. Perfect. Thank you for protecting our data security, Eleanor said, withdrawing the envelope with a practiced smile. She walked away, her hands steady, her mind locking the new puzzle piece into place. Arthur Vance was now legally Damon Cross. The next step required looking into the eyes of the replacement. Later that afternoon, Eleanor spotted Clara Sterling sitting alone by the poolside lounge chairs, reading a book on landscape design. Eleanor changed into a simple, elegant sundress, grabbed a glass of iced tea, and took the lounger next to her. Striking up a conversation was easy. Clara was disarmingly warm, an independent florist from Ohio whose heart was visibly on her sleeve. Within 10 minutes, Clara was glowing, speaking openly about her boyfriend of 2 years. He's a private financial consultant, Clara said, her eyes soft with genuine affection. A widower. He lost his first wife years ago, and they never had children. It's a quiet grief he carries, you know? He moved out west to leave the ghosts behind. Eleanor kept her face a mask of polite empathy, though a cold disgust coated her throat. Arthur hadn't just run, he had rewritten history. He had erased Leo's very existence to present himself as a tragic, unburdened romantic. He sounds devoted, Eleanor murmured gently. Does he still hold on to the past? Sometimes, Clara sighed, pulling up her phone gallery. Look, this was us at our anniversary dinner in Vegas last month. Clara handed her the phone. Eleanor zoomed in on the image of Arthur laughing at a candlelit table. His left hand rested on the white cloth. On his ring finger sat his old gold wedding band, but it was turned inward, the heavy gold face hidden against his palm, leaving only a thin, anonymous sliver of metal visible to the world. It wasn't carelessness. It was a deliberate, daily ritual. Arthur was keeping a hidden token of the life he had butchered, wearing his guilt like a secret luxury while building a beautiful lie with a woman who knew nothing. Eleanor handed the phone back, her heart hardening into absolute stone. The invisible wife was done weeping for the dead. It was time to audit the living. To a seasoned forensic accountant, data was never just a sterile collection of digits bleeding across a spreadsheet. It was a living, breathing trail of human behavior. Numbers left a scent. They possessed a distinct topography, creases where people tried to fold away their secrets, jagged edges where greed outpaced caution, and deep valleys where the truth was deliberately buried. Sitting in the oppressive dark of her resort suite, while the air conditioner hummed a low, metallic drone that vibrated through the drywall, Eleanor Vance stared at the glowing rectangle of her laptop screen. The artificial blue light reflected off the lenses of her glasses, casting two pale, cold discs across the glass. The air in the room smelled faintly of stale carpet cleaner, ozone, and the sharp, tropical sweetness of the welcome orchids rotting in the vanity. Beneath her fingers, the plastic keys of her laptop felt slightly damp from the heavy coastal humidity slipping through the seals of the balcony door. Using the decrypted Nevada driver's license data she had extracted through her carefully executed deception at the front desk, Eleanor had spent the last 2 hours constructing a secure, triple-encrypted data bridge back to Boston. Her fingers moved with mechanical precision, tapping out commands, utilizing an old, secure server she hadn't touched since her days as a senior auditor. She had routed an urgent, raw data dump to her uncle, Robert Vance. Robert was a man whose entire life had been spent navigating the marble-floored corridors of federal courthouses, a veteran litigator who understood how to read the darkest shadows of the law and knew exactly when an anomaly was actually a crime. When the return email finally arrived, the sharp, digital ping of the notification cut through the silence like a gunshot. The sound made Eleanor flinch, her muscles tightening instantly as her fingernails dug into the soft flesh of her palms, drawing a sharp sting of reality. She opened the file, her eyes narrowing as she read. Robert's response was brief, stripped of any comforting familial warmth, written with the cold, clipped precision of an emergency medical triage report. Ellie, I ran the biometric passport markers you pulled from that Nevada file. They were flagged by an IRS criminal investigation registry less than 48 hours ago. But you need to listen to me very carefully, and you need to breathe. Your presence at that resort is not a statistical anomaly. Your trip was not an accident. They know you are there. Get Leo, lock your door, and do not look back. Eleanor closed the laptop slowly, the mechanical click of the plastic hinge sounding unusually loud in the quiet room. Her chest felt constricted, as if the humid, salty air had turned to liquid lead in her lungs, pressing against her ribs. She stood up, her bare feet pressing against the cold, rough fibers of the hotel carpet, and walked out through the heavy sliding glass doors onto the balcony. The night air hit her like a warm, wet blanket, thick with the heavy stench of low tide, rotting seaweed, and the sharp chemical tang of chlorine from the pool below. The ocean was a vast, roaring void in the distance, its waves crashing against the shore with a rhythmic, indifferent thud that vibrated through the concrete soles of her feet. But Eleanor's attention was locked entirely on the immediate courtyard. She gripped the wrought iron railing, the cold, rusted metal biting into the skin of her palms, leaving a faint metallic smell on her hands. Her eyes, trained by a decade of detecting anomalies in massive data structures, began to systematically catalog the physical landscape. The resort looked peaceful to an ordinary eye, illuminated by the soft, amber glow of tiki torches flickering in the night breeze. But Eleanor saw the structural flaws in the piece. 3 men, dressed in immaculate, dark linen suits that hung slightly too heavy around the armpits, were positioned at irregular intervals around the pool deck. One stood near the shadow of a large hibiscus bush. Another leaned against the column near the outdoor bar. The third patrolled the perimeter of the parking lot. They weren't tourists. They weren't looking at the moonlit water, nor were they looking at their phones. Their bodies were coiled, their postures rigid and alert. Every few seconds, their eyes would systematically sweep the exits before turning upward, focusing directly on the 3rd floor eastern wing, the exact block where Arthur's room was located. The mathematical precision of the realization hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. The math finally balanced, but the equation was horrific. Her entire vacation had been a manufactured illusion. For years ago, Arthur had faked his death to escape Raymond Voss, the ruthless architect of a maritime logistics empire that doubled as a multi-billion-dollar money laundering syndicate. Arthur had thought he could disappear into the neon desert of Nevada as Damon Cross. But Arthur had grown arrogant. He had begun quietly collecting secondary digital ledgers, intending to trade them to the FBI in exchange for total immunity and a clean slate. Voss's counterintelligence operatives had intercepted the digital chatter. They knew Arthur was preparing to hand over the encrypted hard drive, but they couldn't locate the physical drive itself. So, the syndicate had looked for the only variable Arthur couldn't completely calculate: his past. They had traced Eleanor's home IP address in Boston. For months, they had monitored her quiet, predictable life. When she microfilm searched a vacation for Leo, Voss's team had intercepted her search history. They had flooded her browser with algorithmically targeted, heavily discounted pop-up advertisements for this specific resort. lowering the price until it was irresistible to a single mother on an accountant's salary. They had led her by the hand into the mouth of the trap. They had brought her and Leo here to serve as breathing, human leverage. The message to Arthur was silent but absolute: surrender the drive, or watch your family pay the interest on your debt. A sudden, sharp metallic scrape against the glass balcony door made Eleanor's blood turn to ice. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. In the shadows of the balcony, a figure emerged from the darkness. He was panting, his breath coming in ragged, shallow wheezes that smelled faintly of expensive bourbon and panic. It was Arthur. He had slipped over the low partition dividing the balconies. He didn't look like the tanned, laughing man from the airport queue, nor did he look like the untouchable phantom she had spent 4 years mourning. His expensive linen shirt was damp with sweat, clinging to his ribs, and his eyes were wide, bloodshot, and rimmed with white. Eleanor stepped back into the room, her hand instantly dropping to her side, her fingers curling around the heavy, brass base of a desk lamp. "Don't come any closer," she whispered, her voice a low, vibrating warning. Arthur slipped through the sliding door, closing it behind him with a desperate, trembling hand. He raised his palms in a frantic, placating gesture, the gold wedding band on his left hand catching the blue light of the laptop screen. As his hand shook, Eleanor could see the band was still turned completely inward, the heavy, engraved face pressed brutally into his own palm, hiding the evidence of his vows from the world while cutting into his own skin. "Ellie, please, you have to listen to me," Arthur hissed, his voice a frantic, desperate spray of syllables. He stepped into the light, and the smell of him hit her, a suffocating mix of expensive cologne, nervous sweat, and the raw, sour scent of fear. "Everything you believe about what happened to me is only half true. I didn't want this. I faked that drowning in Maine to keep you and Leo alive. Voss's people had identified my signature on the audit anomalies. They left a note on the windshield of my car detailing Leo's route to kindergarten. They knew what time you walked to the supermarket. I had to become a ghost. Ellie, if I stayed, Voss would have buried all 3 of us in 60 feet of Atlantic water." Eleanor stood perfectly straight in the center of the room. The blue light of the laptop caught the hard, angular lines of her jaw. She felt no sorrow, no sudden rush of widow's grief reawakened. She felt only a cold, profound disgust that tasted like copper on the back of her tongue. "Is that the narrative you rehearsed while you were buying a house in Henderson, Arthur?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was devoid of inflection, flat and clinical, the voice she used when delivering a terminal audit report to a corrupt corporate board. "Is that the story that helped you sleep at night while you were sleeping in another woman's bed, pretending you were a tragic widower who had never been blessed with a child?" Arthur flinched as if she had struck him across the face. He stepped closer, the floorboards groaning slightly beneath his weight. "You don't understand the scale of what I was dealing with. Voss has men covering every square inch of this property. They tracked me here because I was finalizing a deal with the feds. I have the entire encrypted database on a drive in my room, but Voss knows it. His men are waiting for Dawn to move in. If I don't give them the data, they will kill me, and then they will eliminate you and Leo to clean up the loose ends. We have to run, Ellie. We have to pack Leo's things right now and find a way out through the beach." He reached out, his damp, trembling fingers aiming for her shoulder, trying to pull her into his panic, trying to reestablish the dynamic of the old life, where his crises dictated her reality. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply stepped back, her movement fluid and deliberate. She looked at his face, chiseled but weathered, lined with the stress of a professional liar. And she saw through the architecture of his deception. The invisible wife, the woman who had spent years shrinking her soul to fit into the margins of his silence, was dead. She had been buried in an empty casket 4 years ago, and Eleanor had no intention of resurrecting her. "Stop hiding behind us, Arthur," Eleanor said. The words were quiet, but they carried the immense, crushing weight of 4 years of solitary survival. They cut through the humid air, silencing the frantic hum of his panic. "Look at me. Look at what you actually did. You didn't fake your death to protect Leo. You didn't run to save me. You ran because you were terrified of the prison cell Voss's data would have put you in. You ran because it was easier to let a 5-year-old boy cry himself to sleep every night for a year, wondering what he did wrong to make his father never come home, than it was for you to stand up and face the consequences of your choices." Arthur's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The sour smell of his fear seemed to thicken in the room. "You took the coward's exit, and you called it a sacrifice," Eleanor continued, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, blinding autonomy that made him look away first. "You let me build a funeral around an empty box. You let me struggle to pay the mortgage on a single salary while you kept your wedding ring turned inward like a secret souvenir. You didn't protect us, Arthur. You abandoned us. But tonight, the rules have changed. I am the one protecting my son, and I am not running anywhere with a ghost." Arthur stood in the center of the hotel room, his broad shoulders suddenly slumping, his posture collapsing inward as the structural integrity of his 4-year-old lie completely gave way. The numbers had been audited, the hidden liabilities had been exposed, and for the first time in his life, the analyst had absolutely no data left to hide behind. Eleanor turned her back on him, walking toward the small desk where her laptop sat open. The screen glowed steadily, an unblinking witness to the wreckage of their past. She could hear the faint, uneven rasp of Arthur's breath behind her, a sound that used to fill her with anxiety during their years of silent tension. Now it was just noise, a poorly calibrated machine running out of fuel. She looked toward the adjoining door, where Leo lay sleeping. Through the thin wood, she could hear the soft, rhythmic puff of her son's breath, the only pure thing left in this suffocating coastal trap. She felt a sudden, fierce warmth bloom in her chest, a protective fire that burned away the last remnants of her old life. She was no longer the woman who waited for permission to exist. She was the architect of their survival. "Here is what is going to happen, Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into an icy, operational tone that brooked no argument. She didn't look back at him, her fingers already resting on the trackpad. "You are going to give me the encryption keys to that drive. You are going to tell me exactly how many of Voss's men are downstairs. And then you are going to do exactly what I tell you to do. We are balancing this ledger tonight, and for once you are going to pay what you owe." Arthur stared at her silhouette against the window, the blue light outlining her sharp, unyielding form. He swallowed hard, the click in his throat dry and loud in the quiet room. He realized, with a creeping sense of finality, that the woman he had left behind in Boston had not just survived his absence. She had mastered it. Panic, Eleanor knew, was an inefficient allocation of resources. In the auditing world, when a system was compromised, you didn't cry. You quarantined the threat. Looking at Arthur's trembling frame, she shut down her emotions and let her clinical, analytical mind take absolute control. She had spent the last 24 hours mapping the resort's operational layout, and she wasn't about to let Arthur's 4 years of cowardice ruin her son's future. "Voss wants the drive, Arthur? Fine. We're going to give him an audit he won't survive," Eleanor commanded, her voice cutting through his frantic breathing. She marched to the room desk, grabbed a decoy flash drive from her briefcase, and forcefully shoved it into Arthur's hand. "You are going to walk through the main lobby, right now. Keep your head down, look terrified, and act like you are trying to smuggle this out to the beach. Voss's surveillance team will follow you. You are the bait. Ellie, no, they'll kill me. They won't touch you until they think they have the data, she snapped, pushing him toward the door. Go. Now. The moment Arthur slipped out into the hallway to draw the syndicate's focus, Eleanor pivoted. She grabbed Leo, who was wide awake, his eyes large but remarkably calm. Eleanor didn't take the elevators or the main stairwells. Her accounting background had taught her that the true pulse of any large building lay in its service corridors. She led Leo down the emergency fire exit, pushing through the heavy double doors into the roaring, metallic labyrinth of the resort's commercial kitchens. Amidst the clattering of industrial pots, the hiss of industrial dishwashers, and the shouting of line cooks, Eleanor moved with absolute, calculated purpose. She blended into the background of the chaotic night shift, her hand gripping Leo's firmly. They navigated the labyrinth of stainless steel, exiting through the loading docks at the rear of the property. Waiting in the shadows of the alley was a black, unmarked SUV. The door swung open. Inside sat Special Agent Marcus of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, alongside a team of tactical FBI agents, a counterstrike coordinated entirely by her Uncle Robert over the last 3 hours. Eleanor slid into the back seat, pulled the real encrypted hard drive from the lining of her purse, and handed it to Marcus. Every offshore shell account, customs manifest, and wire routing number from Voss's maritime logistics network is on that drive. I've already verified the cryptographic hashes. The data is clean. Marcus took the drive, his expression hardening with professional respect. We have the perimeter secured, Mrs. Vance. It's over. Before dawn broke over the Gulf Coast, the federal trap snapped shut. Armed with the pristine, unredacted financial data Eleanor had secured, FBI teams swarmed the resort, arresting Raymond Voss and his primary associates before they could even realize the flash drive Arthur carried was completely blank. However, the iron fist of American justice does not accommodate romantic endings. 3 weeks later, the venue shifted to a stark, wood-paneled federal courtroom in Boston. There were no cinematic pardons or unrealistic sentences. The U.S. Attorney's Office made it perfectly clear. While Arthur's cooperation was vital in dismantling Voss's multibillion-dollar syndicate, his actions 4 years ago constituted severe federal felonies. Arthur stood before the bench in a drab civilian suit, his posture broken as the judge read the indictment. He was charged with federal identity theft, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and grand larceny against the maritime insurance carrier that had paid out his death benefit. Under the federal sentencing guidelines, even with maximum cooperation credit, the price of faking a death was non-negotiable. The judge sentenced Arthur to 3 years in a federal penitentiary, stripped him of his fabricated assets, and issued a strict, legally binding restitution order forcing him to repay every single cent of the $240,000 insurance payout through a structured asset liquidation plan. In the gallery, Clara Sterling watched the man she loved crumble into a convicted felon. The realization that her entire 2-year romance had been an elaborate fiction built on federal crimes was too much to bear. Without throwing a single glance toward Arthur, Clara walked out of the courtroom, packed her belongings, and caught the first flight back to Ohio, determined to erase the ghost of Damon Cross from her memory forever. Eleanor watched her leave, feeling a quiet, solemn solidarity with the woman who, like her, had been blinded by the same man's lies. The true measure of an audit, Eleanor had come to understand, was not found in the chaotic moment the discrepancies were uncovered, but in the quiet aftermath when the books were finally balanced. True closure did not require an apology. It required the courage to look at a broken system and choose to build something entirely new on top of it. 2 days before Arthur was scheduled to self-report to the federal penitentiary to begin his 3-year sentence, a final mandatory visitation was arranged at Eleanor's apartment. Arthur had requested it, pleading for a chance to look his son in the eye before the gates closed behind him. The meeting took place in the living room. the most ordinary, sunlit setting for the strangest conversation of their lives. Arthur sat on the edge of the armchair, looking visibly diminished, stripped of the manufactured swagger of Damon Cross. When the door opened and Leo stepped into the room, Arthur broke down entirely. He dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor, tears streaming down his face, his arms reaching out in a desperate, pleading gesture to embrace the boy. "Leo, I am so sorry." Arthur wept, his voice cracking with a heavy, suffocating remorse. "I wanted to protect you. Please, give me a chance to be your dad again." Leo stopped a few feet away. He did not cry, nor did he flinch, inheriting his mother's quiet, steel-spined dignity. The 9-year-old stood perfectly straight, looking down at his father with a calm, steady honesty that only a child who had survived the worst could possess. He didn't reach for the hug. "I already learned how to grow up without you, Dad," Leo said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Go serve your time." The words were not delivered with hatred or anger, but with the simple, devastating clarity of a reality Arthur had created himself. There was no room left for melodrama. Arthur bowed his head, accepting the weight of his sentence, realizing that while he had survived the ocean, he had permanently lost the right to the life he had abandoned. After Arthur entered the federal facility, Eleanor initiated her own deliberate, action-driven reinvention. She refused to let the narrative of the wronged victim define the next chapter of her life. True to her word, she used the untouched, legally protected educational trust to ensure Leo's future remained pristine, while she poured her own focused energy into her career. She spent late nights at her desk, trading sleep for ambition. Within 18 months, she successfully passed the notoriously rigorous Certified Public Accountant (CPA) exam and completed her master's degree in forensic accounting. Her sharp intuition and flawless performance during the Voss investigation caught the attention of the financial sector. She was quickly headhunted and appointed as the Director of Financial Risk Management at a major firm in the city. Her external world shifted to match her internal evolution. Eleanor cut away the tired, muted wardrobe of her past, the clothes of a woman trying to disappear into the background of a house that didn't love her. She adopted sharp, beautifully tailored blazers, reclaimed her physical health through consistent running, and began to radiate the commanding, effortless elegance of a woman in absolute control of her own destiny. The story reached its true equilibrium on a crisp, late autumn afternoon in Boston. Eleanor stood on the balcony of her newly purchased high-rise apartment, looking out over the city skyline. The sky above was ablaze with the rich, amber, and honeyed tones of the golden hour. The light washed over her, warm and absolute, illuminating the sharp contours of her face and the calm strength in her eyes. Through the open glass door behind her, she could hear the comforting, rhythmic sounds of home. Leo was in the dining room, moving efficiently, setting the table for the two of them, while humming a melody he had picked up at school. He was thriving, grounded, and safe. Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle inside her. She looked out at the horizon and realized she was smiling, a smile of profound, unburdened serenity. The bitter resentment she had carried toward Arthur had entirely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but clean, empty space. She no longer felt the sting of the invisible wife, nor did she carry the heavy shroud of the grieving widow. The life they could have had was buried, not with anger, but with peace. Arthur had survived the water, but their marriage hadn't, and accepting that truth hurt infinitely less than living inside a lie ever could. Eleanor stood tall in the fading light, autonomous, financially free, fiercely proud, and beautifully, permanently reborn. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. Please like, share, and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Hope to see you on the next page.